Good evening, pretty shiny peoples. I apologize for the late start. It has been a very, very busy day, and we're just gonna leave that right there. Um, because it's such a late start, I am not likely to stream tonight, which, to be fair, probably wasn't going to be very likely again anyway. It was probably going to be about as likely as it would have been last week. But I will eventually stream again. Things have just been not very conducive to doing so lately. That being said, though, I mean, I guess I could be talked into it tomorrow, maybe, by certain people anyway. But stream or no stream, we will finish the first book in the Dark Tower series for book club because I said we would. I said we would, and so we will. Um, yeah, yep. And this is the shortest book in the series, just so everybody, they're like, oh, we got that, we got through that in 3. Yes, but every other book is much longer than this one. So the gunslinger shot the dark dude. Okay. We are on chapter 4. There's only 5 chapters in this book, but like I said before, his chapters are very long and he divides them into sections. So, anyway, chapter 4 is called The Slow Mutants. The gunslinger spoke slowly to Jake in the rising and falling inflections of one who speaks in his sleep. There was 3 of us that night, Cuthbert, Elaine, and me. We weren't supposed to be there because none of us had passed from the time of children. We were still in our clouts, as they say as the saying went. If we'd been caught, Court would have striped us bloody, but we weren't. I don't think any of the ones that went before us were caught either. Boys must have put on their father's pants in private, strut them in front of the mirror, and then sneak them back on the hangers. It was like that. The father pretends he doesn't notice the new way the pants are hung up, or the traces of boot polish mustaches still under their shoes. Do you see? The boy said nothing. He'd said nothing since they had passed from the daylight. The gunslinger, on the other hand, had talked hectically, feverishly, to fill the silence. He had not looked back at the light as they passed into the land beneath the mountains, but the boy had. The gunslinger had read the failing of day in the soft mirror of Jake's cheek. Now faint rose, now milk glass, now pallid silver, now the last dusk glow touch of the evening, now nothing. The gunslinger had struck a false light, and they had gone on. Finally, they camped. No echo from the man in black returned to them. Perhaps he had stopped to rest too, or perhaps he floated onward and without running lights, through nighted chambers. The sewing night coalition, the Kamala, some of the older folks called it, after the word for rice, was had once a year in the Western Hall, the gunslinger went on. The proper name was the Hall of the Grandfathers, but to us it was only the Western Hall. The sound of dripping water came to their ears. According right, and any spring dance surely is, the gunslinger laughed and I'm gonna stumble again tonight, sorry about that. Deprecatingly, the intense walls turned the sound into a loon-like wheeze. In the old days, the book says, it was the welcoming of spring, what was sometimes called New Earth, or fresh Kamala, the civilization, you know? He trailed off, unable to describe the change inherent in that featureless noun, the death of romance, and the lingering of its sterile, carnal reverent. A world living on the forced respiration of glitter and ceremony, the geometric steps of make-believe courtship during the snow night coddle, that had replaced the truer, madder scribble-scrabble of love, which he could only intuit dimly, a hollow grandeur in place of true passions which might once have built kingdoms and sustained them. He found the truth with Susan Delgado and Meji's, only to lose it again. Once there was a king, he might have told the boy, the eld whose blood, attenured through it may be, still flows in my veins. But kings are done, lad, in the world of light anyway. They made something decadent out of it, the gunslinger said at last. A play, a game. In his voice was all the unconscious distaste of the ascetic and the eremite. His face, had there been stronger light to illuminate it, would have shown harshness and sorrow, the purest kind of condemnation. His essential force had not been cut or diluted by the passage of years. The lack of imagination that still remained in that face was remarkable. But the ball, the gunslinger said, the sewing night Kodal. The boy did not speak, did not ask. There were crystal chandeliers, heavy glass with electric spark lights. It was all light. It was an island of light. We sneaked into one of the old balconies, the ones that were supposed to be unsafe and roped off, but we were boys, and boys will be boys, so they will. To us, everything was dangerous, but what of that? Had we not been made to live forever? We thought so, even when we spoke to each other of our glorious deaths. We were above everyone and could look down on everything. I don't remember that any of us said anything. We only drank it up with our eyes. There was a great stone table where the gunslingers and their women sat at meat watching the dancers. Few of the gunslingers also danced, but only a few, and they were the young ones. The one who sprang the trap on Hacks was one of the dancers, I seem to recall. The elders only sat, and it seemed to me that they were half embarrassed in all that light, all that civilized light. They were revered once, the feared ones, the guardians, but they seemed like holsters in the crowd of cavaliers with their soft women. There were 4 circular tables loaded with food, and they turned all the time. The cook's boys never stopped coming and going from 7 until 3 o'clock the next morning. The tables were like clocks, and we could smell the roast pork, beef, lobster, chickens, baked apples. The odors changed as the tables turned. There was ices and candies. There were great flaming skewers of meat. Martin sat next to my mother and father. I knew them from so high above, and once she and Martin danced, slowly and revolvingly, and the others cleared the floor for them and clapped when it was over. The gunslingers did not clap, but my father stood slowly and held his hands out to her, and she went to him, smiling, holding out her own. It was a moment of enormous gravity. Even we felt it in our high hiding place. My father had by then taken control of his catet, you must ken, the tet of the gun, and was on the verge of becoming Din of Gilead, if not all in world. The rest knew it. Martin knew it better than any, except, perhaps, for Gabriel Varese, that was. The boy spoke at last, and with seeming reluctance. She was your mother? Aye, Gabrielle of the Waters, daughter of Alan, wife of Stephen, mother of Roland. The gunslinger spread his hands apart in a mocking little gesture that seemed to say, "Here I am, and what of it?" then dropped them into his lap again. My father was the last Lord of Light. The gunslinger looked down at his hands. The boy said nothing more. I remember how they danced, the gunslinger said. My mother and Martin, the gunslinger's counselor. I remember how they danced, revolving slowly together and apart in the old steps of courtship. He looked at the boy, smiling. But it meant nothing, you know, because power had been passed in some way that none of them knew but all understood, and my mother was grown root and branch to the holder and wielder of that power. Was it not so? She went to him when the dance was over, didn't she? And clasped his hands. Did they applaud? Did the hall ring with it as those pretty boys and their soft ladies applauded and lauded him? Did it? Did it? Bitter water dripped distantly in the darkness. The boy said nothing. I remember how they danced, the gunslinger said softly. I remember how they danced. He looked up at the unseeable stone roof, and it seemed for a moment that he might scream at it, rail at it, challenge it blindly, those blind and tongueless tonnages of granite that now bore their tiny lives like microbes in its stone intestine. What hand could have held the knife that did my father to his death? I'm tired, the boy said, and then again said no more. The gunslinger lapsed into silence, and the boy laid over and put one hand between his cheek and the stone. The little flame in front of them guttered. The gunslinger rolled the smoke. It seemed he could see the crystal light still in the eye of his memory, hear the shout of the accolade, empty in a husked land that stood even then hopeless against a gray ocean of time. Remembering that its island of light hurt him bitterly, and he wished he had never held witness to it, or to his father's cuckoldry. He passed smoke between his mouth and nostrils, looking down at the boy. How we make large circles in the earth for ourselves, he thought. Around we go, back to the start, and start is there again. Resumption, which was never the curse of daylight. How long before we see daylight again? He slept. After the sound of his breathing had become long, steady, and regular, the boy opened his eyes and looked at the gunslinger with an expression of sickness and love. The last light of the fire caught in one pupil for a moment and was drowned there. He went to sleep. The gunslinger had lost most of his time sense in the desert, which was changeless. He lost the rest of it here in this passage under the mountains, which was lightless. Neither of them had any means of telling the clock, and the concept of hours became meaningless, abnegate. In a sense, they stood outside of time. A day might have been a week, or a week a day. They walked and they slept. They ate thin meals, and that did not satisfy their bellies. Their only companion was the steady, thundering rush of the water, drilling its auger path through stone. They followed it and drank from its flat, mineral-salted depth, hoping there was nothing in it that would make them sick or kill them. Sorry about that. And now I lost my place because I was distracted by the puppy. Okay. At times, the gunslinger thought he saw fugitive drifting lights like corpse lamps beneath its surface, but supposed they were only projections of his brain which had not forgotten the light. Still, he cautioned the boy not to put his feet in the water. The rangefinder in his head took them on steadily. The path beside the river, for it was a path, smooth and sunken to a slight concavity, led always upward toward the river's head. At regular intervals they came to a curved stone pylons with sunken ring bolts. Perhaps once oxen or stage horses had been tethered there. At each was a steel flagon holding an electric torch, but these were all barren of life and light. During the third period of rest before sleep, the boy wandered away a little. The gunslinger could hear a small conversation of rattled pebbles as Jake moved cautiously. Careful, he said. You can't see where you are. I'm crawling. Say, what is it? The gunslinger half crouched, touching the hilt of the gun. There was a slight pause. The gunslinger strained his eyes uselessly. I think it's a railroad, the boy said dubiously. The gunslinger got up and walked toward the sound of Jake's voice, leading with one foot, lightly, to test for pitfalls. Here. A hand reached out and cat-pawed the gunslinger's face. The boy was very good in the dark, better than Roland himself. His eyes seemed to dilate until there was no color left in them. The gunslinger saw this as he struck a meager light. There was no fuel in his rock boom, and what they had brought with them was going rapidly to ash. At times the urge to strike a light was well nigh insatiable. They had discovered one could grow as hungry for light as for food. The boy was standing beside a curved rock wall that was lined with parallel metal staves running off into the darkness. Each carried black nodes that might once have been conductors of electricity, and beside and below, set only inches off the stone floor, were tracks of what might have run on those tracks at one time. The gunslinger could only imagine sleek electric bullets firing their courses through this forever night with of frightened searchlight eyes going before. He had never heard of such things, but there were many remnants of the gone world, just as there were demons. The gunslinger had once come upon a hermit who'd gained a quasi religious power over a miserable flock of kind keepers by possession of an ancient gasoline pump. The hermit crouched beside it, one arm wrapped possessively around it, and preached wild, guttering sermons. He occasionally placed the still bright steel nozzle, which was attached to a rotted rubber hose between his legs, on the pump in perfectly legible, although rust-clotted letters, and a legend of unknown meaning. Amico, lead free. Amico had become the totem of a thunder god, and they had worshipped him with the slaughter of sheep and the sound of engines. Hulks, the gunslingers thought, only meaningless hulks poking from the sands that once were seas, and now a railroad. We'll follow it, he said. The boy said nothing. The gunslinger extinguished the light, and they slept. When Roland awoke, the boy was up before him, sitting on one of the rails and watching him sightlessly in the dark. They followed the rails like blind men, Roland leading, Jake following. They slipped their feet along one rail, always. Also, like blind men, the steady rush of the river off to the right was their companion. They did not speak, and this went on for 3 periods of walking. The gunslinger felt no urge to think coherently or to plan. His sleep was dreamless. During the 4th period of waking and walking, they literally stumbled on a handcar. The gunslinger ran into it at chest high, and the boy walking on the other side struck his forehead and went down with a cry. The gunslinger made a light immediately. Are you all right? The words sounded sharp and angry, and he winced at them. Yes. The boy was holding his head gingerly. He shook it once to make sure he had told the truth. They turned to look at what they had run into. It was a flat, square plate of metal that sat mutely on the tracks. There was a seesaw handle in the center of the square, and it descended into a connection of cogs. The gunslinger had no immediate sense of the thing's purpose, but the boy grasped it at once. It's a handcar. What? Handcar, the boy said impatiently. Like in the old cartoons. Look. He pulled himself up and went to the handle. He managed to push it down, but it took all his weight hung over the handle to turn the trick. The handcar moved a foot, with silent timelessness on the rails. Good, said a faint mechanical voice. It made them both jump. Good. Push again. The mechanical voice died out. It works a little hard, the boy said, as if apologizing for the thing. Gunslinger pulled himself up beside Jake and shoved the handle down. The handcar moved forward obediently, then stopped. Good. Push again, the mechanical voice encouraged. He had felt a drive shaft turn beneath his feet. The operation pleased him, and so did the mechanical voice, although he intended to listen to that no longer than necessary. Other than the pump at the way station, this was the first machine he'd seen in years that still worked well. But the thing disquieted him, too. It would take them to their destination that much quicker. He had no doubt whatever the man in black had meant for them to find this, too. Neat, huh? The boy said, and his voice was full of loathing. The silence was deep. Roland could hear his organs at work inside his body and the drip of the water and nothing else. You stand on one side, I stand on the other, Jake said. You'll have to push by yourself until it gets rolling good. Then I can help. First you push, then I push. We'll go right along. Get it? I get it, the gunslinger said. His hands were in helpless, despairing fists. But you'll have to push by yourself until it gets rolling good, the boy repeated, looking at him. The gunslinger had a sudden, vivid picture of the great hall a year or so after the sewing night coalition. By then it had been nothing but shattered shards in the wake of a revolt, civil strife, and invasion. This image was followed by one of Allie, the scarred woman from Tull, pushed and pulled by bullets that were killing her for no reason at all, unless reflex was a reason. Next came Cuthbert Allgood's face, laughing as he went downhill to his death, still blowing that God's damned horn. And then he saw Susan's face, twisted, made ugly with weeping. All my old friends, the gunslinger thought, and smiled hideously. I'll push, the gunslinger said. He began to push, and when the voice began to speak, good, push again, good, push again, he sent his hand fumbling along the post upon which the seesaw handle had been balanced. At last he found what it was surely looking for, a button. He pushed it. Goodbye, pal, the mechanical voice said cheerily, and was then blessedly silent for some hours. They rolled on through the dark, faster now, no longer having to feel their way. The mechanical voice spoke up once, suggesting they eat crispella, and again to say that nothing's satisfied at the end of a hard day like larchies. Following this second piece of advice, it spoke no more. Once the awkwardness of a buried age had been run off the handcar, it went smoothly. The boy tried to do his share, and the gunslinger allowed him small shifts, but mostly he pumped by himself in a large and chest-stretching rising and falling. The underground river was their companion, sometimes closer on their right, sometimes further away. Once it took on a huge and thunderous hollowness as if passing through some great cathedral narthex. Once the sound of it disappeared almost altogether. The speed and the made wind against their faces seemed to take the place of sight and to drop them once again into a frame of time. The gunslinger estimated they were making anywhere from 10 to 15 miles an hour, always on a shallow, almost imperceptible uphill grade that wore him out deceptively. When they stopped, he slept like the stone itself. Their food was almost gone again. Neither of them worried about it. For the gunslinger, the tenseness of a coming climax was as imperceivable but as real and accretive as the fatigue of propelling the handcar. They were close to the end of the beginning, or at least he was. He felt like a performer placed on center stage minutes before the rise of the curtain, settled in a position with his first line held securely in his mind. He heard the unseen audience rattling programs and settling in their seats. He lived with a tight, tidy ball of unholy anticipation in his belly and welcomed the exercise that let him sleep. And when he did sleep, it was like the dead. The boy spoke less and less, but at their stopping place one sleep period not long before they were attacked by the slow mutants, he asked the gunslinger, almost shyly, about his coming of age. For I would hear more of that, he said. The gunslinger had been leaning with his back against the handle, a cigarette from his dwindling supply of tobacco clamped in his lips. He had been on the verge of his usual unthinking sleep when the boy asked his question. Why would thee still know that? He asked, amused. The boy's voice was curiously stubborn, as if hiding embarrassment. I just would. And after a pause, he added, I always wondered about growing up. I bet it's mostly lies. What you'd hear of wasn't my growing up, the gunslinger said. I suppose I did the first of that not long after what thee'd hear of. When you fought your teacher, Jake said remotely. That's what I want to hear. Roland nodded. Yes, of course. The day he had tried the line. That was a story any boy might want to hear, all right. My real growing up didn't start until after my dad sent me away. I finished doing it at one place and another along the way. He paused. I saw a not man hung once. And not man? I don't understand. You could feel him, but you couldn't see him. Jake nodded, seeming to understand. He was invisible. Roland raised his eyebrows. He had never heard the word before. Do you say so? Yes. Then let it be so. In any case, there were folks who didn't want me to do it. Felt they'd be cursed if I did it, but the fellow had gotten a taste for rape. Do you know what that is? Yes, Jake said. And I bet an invisible guy would be good at it too. How did you catch him? That was a tale for another day, knowing there would be no other days, both of them knowing there would be no others. 2 years after that, I left a girl in a place called Kingstown, although I didn't want to. Sure you did, the boy said, and the contempt in his voice was no less for the softness of his tone. Gotta catch up with that tower, am I right? Gotta keep her riding, just like the cowboys on my dad's network. Roland felt his face flush with the heat in the dark, but when he spoke, his voice was even. That was the last part, I guess. Of my growing up, I mean. I never knew any of the parts when they happened, only later did I know that. He realized with some unease that he was avoiding what the boy wanted to hear. I suppose the coming of age was part of it, at that, he said almost grudgingly. He was formal, almost sterilized, like a dance. He laughed unpleasantly, and the boy said nothing. It was necessary to prove oneself in battle, the gunslinger began. Summer and hot. Full earth had come to the land like a vampire lover that year, killing the land and the crops of the tenant farmers, turning the fields of the castle city of Gilead white and sterile. In the west, some miles distant and near the borders that were at the end of the civilized world, fighting had already begun. All the reports were bad, and all of them paled to insignificance before the heat that rested over this place of the center. Cattle lawed empty-eyed in the pens of the stockyards. Pigs grunted lustfully, unmindful of sows and sex and knives whetted for the coming fall. People whined about taxes and conscription as they always did, but there was an apathy beneath the empty passion play of politics. The center had frayed like a rag rug that had been washed and walked on and shaken and hung and dried. The thread that held the last jewel of the breast of the world was unraveling. Things were not holding together. The earth drew in its breath in the summer of the coming eclipse. The boy idled along the upper corridor of this stone place which was home, sensing these things, not understanding. He was also dangerous and empty, waiting to be filled. It was 3 years since the hanging of the cook who had always been able to find snacks for hungry boys. Roland had lengthened and filled out both its shoulder and hip, now dressed only in faded denim pants. 14 years old. He had come to look like the man he would become, lean and lank and quick on his feet. He was still unbedded, but two of the younger slatterns of a West Town merchant had cast eyes on him. He had felt a response, and felt it more strongly now. Even in the coolness of the passage, he felt sweat on his body. Ahead were his mother's apartments, and he approached them incuriously, meaning only to pass them and go upward to the roof, where a thin breeze and the pleasure of his hand awaited. He had passed the door when a voice called him. You, boy. It was Martin, the counselor. He was dressed with a suspicious, upsetting casualness, black whipcord trousers almost as tight as leotards and a white shirt open halfway down his hairless chest. His hair was tousled. The boy looked at him silently. Come in, come in. Don't stand in the hall. Your mother wants to speak to you. He was smiling with his mouth, but the lines of his face held a deeper, more sardonic humor. Beneath that, and in his eyes, there was only coldness. In truth, his mother did not seem to want to see him. She sat in the low-backed chair by the large window in the central parlor of her apartments, the one which overlooked the hot blank stone of the central courtyard. She was dressed in a loose, informal gown that kept slipping from one white shoulder, and looked at the boy only once. A quick, glinting, rueful smile, like autumn sun on a rill of water. During the interview which followed, she studied her hands rather than her son. He saw her seldom now, and the phantom of cradle songs had almost faded from his brain. But she was a beloved stranger. He felt an amorphous fear and and an inchoate and an inchoate hatred for Martin, his father's closest adviser, was born. "Are you well, Rome?" she asked him softly. Martin stood beside her, a heavy, disturbing hand near the juncture of her white shoulder and white neck, smiling on them both. His brown eyes were dark to the point of blackness with smiling. "Yes," he said. "Your studies go well. Vinay is pleased. And court?" Her mouth quirked at this second name as if she had tasted something bitter. "I'm trying," he said. They both knew he was not flashingly intelligent like Cuthbert, or even quick like Jamie. He was a plodder and a bludgeoner. Even Elaine was better at studies. And David? She knew his affection for the hawk. The boy looked up at Martin, still smiling patternally down on all this. Past his prime? His mother seemed to wince. For a moment, Martin's face seemed to darken, his grip on her shoulder to tighten. Then she looked out into the hot whiteness of the day, and all of this was as it had been. It's a charade, he thought. A game. Who is playing with whom? You have a cut on your forehead, Martin said, still smiling, and pointed a negligent finger at the mark of Court's latest "Thank you for the instructive day" bashing. Are you going to be a fighter like your father? Or are you just slow? This time she did wince. Both, the boy said. He looked steadily at Martin and smiled painfully. Even in here it was very hot. Martin stopped smiling abruptly. "You can go to the roof now, boy. I believe you have business there." My mother has not yet dismissed me, bondsman." Martin's face twisted as if the boy had lashed him with a quirt. The boy heard his mother's dreadful, woeful gasp. She spoke his name. But the painful smile remained intact on the boy's face, and he stepped forward. "Will you give me a sign of fealty, bondsman, in the name of my father whom you serve?" Martin stared at him, rankly unbelieving. "Go," Martin said gently. "Go and find your hand." Smiling rather horribly, the boy went. As he closed the door and went back the way he came, he heard his mother wail. It was a banshee sound. And then, unbelievably, the sound of his father's man striking her and telling her to shut her quack. To shut her quack? And then he heard Martin's laugh. The boy continued to smile as he went to his test. Jamie had come from the shops, and when he saw the boy crossing the exercise yard, he ran to tell Roland the latest gossip of bloodshed and the revolt to the west. But he fell aside, the words all unspoken. They had known each other since the time of infantry, and as boys they had dared each other, cuffed each other, and made 1,000 explorations of the walls within which they had both been birthed. The boy strode past him, staring without seeing, grinning his painful grin. He was walking towards Court's cottage, where the shades were drawn to ward off the savage afternoon heat. Court napped in the afternoon so that he could enjoy to the fullest extent his evening tomcat forays into the mazed and filthy brothels of the lower town. Jamie knew in a flash of intuition, knew what was to come, and in his fear and ecstasy he was torn between following Roland and going after the others. Then his hypnotism was broken, and he ran toward the main building, screaming, Cuthbert! Elaine! Thomas! His screams sounded puny and thin in the heat. They had known all of them in that intuitive way boys have, that Roland would be the first of them to try the line. But this was too soon. The hideous grin on Roland's face galvanized him as no news of wars, revolts, and witchcraft could have done. This was more than the words from a toothless mouth given over a fly-specked heads of lettuce. Roland walked to the cottage of his teacher and kicked the door open. It slammed backward, hit the plain rough plaster of the wall, and rebounded. He had never been inside before. The entrance opened on an austere kitchen that was cool and brown, a table, two straight chairs, two cabinets, a faded linoleum floor, tracked in black paths from the cooler set in the floor to the corner where knives hung, and to the table. Here was a public man's privacy, the faded refuge of a violent midnight carouser who had loved the boys of 3 generations roughly and made some of them into gunslingers. Court! He kicked the table, sending it across the room and into the counter. Knives from the wall rack fell in twinkling jackstraw. There was a thick stirring in the other room, a half-sleep clearing of the throat. The boy did not enter, knowing it was a sham, knowing that Cora had awakened immediately in the cottage's other room and stood with one glittering eye beside the door waiting to break the intruder's unwary neck. Court, I want you, bondsman. Now he spoke the high speech, and Court swung the door open. He was dressed in thin underwear shorts, a squat man with bow legs running with scars from top to toe, thick with twists of muscle. There was a round, bulging belly. The boy knew from experience that it was a spring steel. The one good eye glared at him from the bashed and dented, hairless head. The boy saluted formally. Teach me no more, bondsman. Today I teach you. You are early, Puler, Court said casually, but he also spoke the high speech. 2 years early, at the very best, I should judge. I will ask you only once. Will you cry off? The boy only smiled his hideous, painful smile, for Court, who had seen the smile on a score of bloodied, scarlet-skied fields of horror and dishonor, it was answer enough. Perhaps the only answer he would have believed. It's too bad, the teacher said absently. You've been a most promising pupil, the best in 2 dozen years, I should say. It will be sad to see you broken and set upon a blind path, but the world has moved on. Bad times are on horseback. The boy still did not speak, and would have been incapable of any coherent explanation had it been required, but for the first time the awful smile softened a little. Still, there is the line of blood, Court said. Revolt and witchcraft to the west or no, I am your bondsman, boy. I recognize your command, and bow to it now, if never again, with all my heart. And Court, who had cuffed him, kicked him, bled him, cursed him, made mock of him, and called him the very eye of syphilis, bent to one knee and bowed his head. The boy touched the leathery, vulnerable flesh of his neck with wonder. Rise, bondman, in love. Court stood slowly, and there might have been pain behind the impassive mask of his ringed features. This is waste. Cry off, you foolish boy. I break my own oath. Cry off and wait. The boy said nothing. Very well. If you say so, let it be so. Court's voice became dry and businesslike. 1 hour, and the weapon of your choice. You will bring your stick? I always have. How many sticks have been taken from you, Court? Which was tantamount to asking, how many boys have entered the square yard beyond the great hall and returned as gunslinger apprentices? No stick will be taken from me today, Court said slowly. I regret it. There is only the once, boy. The penalty for overeagerness is the same as the penalty for unworthiness. Can you not wait? The boy recalled Martin standing over him, the smile and the sound of the blow from behind the closed door. No. Very well. What weapon do you choose? The boy said nothing. Court's smile showed a jagged ring of teeth. Wise enough to begin. In an hour. You realize you will in all probability never see your father, your mother, or your cob abbeys again. I know what exile means, Roland said softly. Go now, and meditate on your father's face. Much good will it do ya. The boy went without looking back. The cellar of the barn was spuriously cool, dank, smelling of cobwebs and earth water. The sun lit it in dusty rays from narrow windows, but there was none of the day's heat. The boy kept the hawk here, and the bird seemed comfortable enough. David no longer hunted the sky. His feathers had lost the radiant animal brightness of 3 years ago, but the eyes were still as piercing and motionless as ever. You cannot friend a hawk, they said, unless you are a half-hawk yourself. Alone and only a sojourner in the land, without friends or need of them, the hawk pays no coinage to love or morals. David was an old hawk now. The boy hoped that he himself was a young one. Hi, he said softly and extended his arm to the tethered perch. The hawk stepped onto the boy's arm and stood motionless, unhooded. With his other hand, the boy reached into his pocket and fished out a bit of dried jerky. The hawk snapped it deftly from between his fingers and made it disappear. The boy began to stroke David very carefully. Court most probably would not have believed it if he had seen it. The court did not believe the boy's time had come, either. I think you died today, he said, continuing to stroke. I think you will be made a sacrifice, like all those little birds we trained you on. Do you remember? No? It doesn't matter. After today, I am the hawk, and each year on this day, I'll shoot the sky in your memory. David stood on his arm, silent and unblinking, indifferent to his life or death. You are old, the boy said reflectively, and perhaps not my friend. Even a year ago, you would have had my eyes instead of that little string of meat, isn't it so? Court would laugh. But we got close enough to the Chari man, if he don't suspect. Which will it be, David? Age or friendship? David did not say. The boy hooded him and found the jesses, which were looped at the end of David's perch, and they left the barn. The yard behind the great hall was not really a yard at all, but only a green corridor whose walls were formed by tangled, thick-grown hedges. It had been used for the rite of coming of age since time out of mind, long before Court and his predecessor Mark, who had died of a stab wound from an overzealous hand in this place. Many boys had left the corridor from the east end, where the teachers always entered as men. The east end faced the great hall and all the civilization and intrigue of the lighted world. Many more had slunk away, beaten and bloody from the west end, where the boys always entered as boys forever. The west end faced the farms and the hut dwellers beyond the farms, beyond that the tangled barbarian forests, and beyond that Garland, and beyond Garland the Mohaine Desert. The boy who became a man progressed from darkness and unlearning to light and responsibility. The boy who was beaten could only retreat. Forever and ever, the hallway was as smooth and green as the gaming field. It was exactly 50 yards long. In the middle was a swatch of shaven earth, and this was the line. Each end was usually clogged with tense spectators and relatives, for the ritual was usually forecast with great accuracy. 18 was the most common age. Those who had not made their test by age 25 usually slipped into obscurity as freeholders, unable to face the brutal all or nothing fact of the field and the test. But on this day there were none but Jamie de Curry, Cuthbert Allgood, Elaine Johns, and Thomas Whitman. They clustered at the boy's end, gape-mouthed and frankly terrified. "Your weapon, stupid," Cuthbert hissed in agony. "You forgot your weapon." "I have it," the boy said. Dimly he wondered if the news of this lunacy had reached yet to the central buildings, to his mother and to Martin. His father was on a hunt, not due back for days. In this he felt a sense of shame, for he felt that in his father he would have found understanding, if not approval. "Has Court come?" "Court is here." The voice came from the far end of the corridor, and Court stepped into view, dressed in a short singlet. A heavy leather hand encircled his forehead to keep sweat from his eyes. He wore a dirty girdle to hold his back straight. He held an ironwood stick in one hand, sharp on one end, heavily blunted and spatulate on the other. He began a litany which all of them, chosen by the blind blood of their fathers all the way back to the eld, had known since early childhood, learned against the day when they would, perhaps, become men. "Have you come here for a serious purpose, boy?" "I have come here for a serious purpose." "Have you come as an outcast from your father's house?" "I have come so, and would remain an outcast until he had bested Court. If Court bested him, he would remain an outcast forever." "Have you come with your chosen weapon?" "I have." "What is your weapon?" This was the teacher's advantage, his chance to adjust his plan of battle to the sling or spear or bow or bow. "My weapon is David." Court halted only briefly. He was surprised and very likely confused. That was good. Might be good. "So then, have you at me, boy?" "I do." "In whose name?" "In the name of my father." "Say his name." "Stephen Deshane, of the line of Eld." "Be swift, then." And Court advanced into the corridor, switching his stick from one hand to the other. The boys sighed flutteringly like birds as their Don Din stepped to meet them. "My weapon is David, teacher." Did Court understand? And if so, did he understand fully? If he did, very likely all was lost. It turned on surprise and on whatever stuff the hawk had left him. Would he only sit, disinterested and stupid, on the boy's arm while Court struck him brainless with the ironwood, or seek escape in the high, hot sky? As they drew close together, each for the nonce still on his side of the line, the boy loosened the hawk's hood with nerveless fingers. It dropped to the green grass, and Court halted in his tracks. He saw the old warrior's eye drop to the bird and widen with surprise and slow dawning comprehension. Now he understood. "Oh, you little fool," Court nearly groaned, and Roland was suddenly furious that he should be spoken to so. "At him!" he cried, raising his arm, and David flew like a silent brown bullet, stubby wings pumping once, twice, 3 times before crashing into Court's face, talons searching, beak digging. Red drops flew up into the hot air. Hi, Roland, Cuthbert screamed deliriously. First blood! First blood to my bosom! He struck his chest hard enough to leave a bruise there that would not fade for a week. Court staggered backwards, off balance. The ironwood staff rose and beat futilely at the air around his head. The hawk was an undulating, blurred bundle of feathers. The boy, meanwhile, arrowed forward, his hand held out in a straight wedge, his elbows locked. This was his chance, and very likely the only one he'd have. Still, Court was almost too quick for him. The bird had covered 90% of his vision, but the ironwood came up again, spatula in forward, and Court cold-bloodedly performed the only action that could turn events at this point. He beat his own face 3 times, biceps flexing mercilessly. David fell away, broken and twisted. One wing flapped frantically at the ground. His cold, predator's eyes stared fiercely into the teacher's bloody, streaming face. Court's bad eye now bulged blindly from its socket. The boy had delivered a kick to Court's temple, connecting solidly. It should have ended, but it did not. For a moment, Court's face went slack, and then he lunged, grabbing the boy's foot. The boy skipped back and tripped over his own feet. He went down a sprawl. He heard from far away the sound of Jamie screaming in dismay. Court was ready to fall on him and finish it. Roland had lost his advantage, and both of them knew it. For a moment they looked at each other, and the teacher standing over the pupil with gouts of blood pouring from the left side of his face, the bad eye now closed except for a thin slit of white. There would be no brothels for Court this night. Something ripped jaggedly at the boy's hand. It was David, tearing blindly at whatever he could reach. Both wings were broken. It was incredible that he still lived. The boy grabbed him, and like a stone, unmindful of the driving beak that was taking the flesh from his wrist in ribbons as Court flew at him, all spread eagle, the boy threw the hawk upward. Hi, David, kill! Then Court blotted out the sun and came down atop him. The bird was smashed between them, and the boy felt a calloused thumb probe for the socket of his eye. He turned it at the same time, bringing up the slab of his thigh to block Court's crotch-seeking knee, his own hand flailing against the tree of Court's neck in 3 hard chops. It was like hitting ribbed stone. Then Court made a thick grunting. His body shuddered. Faintly, the boy saw one hand flailing for the dropped stick, and with a jackknife lung, he kicked it out of reach. David had hooked one talon into Court's right ear. The other battered mercilessly at the teacher's cheek, making it a ruin. Warm blood splattered the boy's face, smelling of sheared copper. Court's fist struck the bird once, breaking its back. Again, and the neck snapped away at a crooked angle, and still the talon clutched. There was no ear now, only a red hole tunneled into the side of Court's skull. The third blow sent the bird flying, at last clearing Court's face. The moment it was clear, the boy brought the edge of his hand across the bridge of his teacher's nose, using every bit of his strength and breaking the thin bone. Blood sprayed. Court's gasping, unseeing hand ripped at the boy's buttocks, trying to pull his trousers down, trying to hobble him. Roland rolled away, found Court's stick, and rose to his knees. Court came to his own knees, grinning. Incredibly, they faced each other that way from either side of the line, although they had switched positions, and Court was now on the other side, where Roland had begun the contest. The old warrior's face was curtained with gore. The one-seeing eye rolled furiously in its socket. The nose was smashed over to a haunted leaning angle. Both cheeks hung in flaps. The boy held the man's stick like a grand points player waiting for the pitch of the rawhide bird. Court double fainted, then came directly at him. Roland was ready, not fooled in the slightest by this last trick, which both knew was a poor one. The ironwood swung in a flat arc, striking Court's skull with a dull, thudding noise. Court fell on his side, looking at the boy with a lazy, unseeing expression. A tiny trickle of spit came from his mouth. Yield or die, the boy said. His mouth was filled with wet cotton, and Court smiled. Nearly all consciousness was gone, and he would remain tended in his cottage for a week after, wrapped in the blackness of a coma. But now he held on with all the strength of his pitiless, shadowless life. He saw the need to palaver in the boy's eyes, and even with a curtain of blood between the two of them, understood that the need was desperate. I yield, Gunslinger. I yield smiling. You have this day remembered the face of your father and all those who came before him. What a wonder you have done. Court's clear eye closed. The gunslinger shook him gently, but with persistence. The others were around him now, their hands trembling to thump his back and hoist him to their shoulders, but they held back, afraid, sensing a new gulf. Yet this was not as strange as it could have been, because there had always been a gulf between this one and the rest. Court's eyes rolled open again. The key, the gunslinger said. My birthright, teacher. I need it. His birthright was the guns. Not the heavy ones of his father, weighted with sandalwood, but guns all the same, forbidden to all but a few, in the heavy vault under the barracks, where he by ancient law was now required to abide away from his mother's breast, hung his apprentice weapons, heavy, cumbersome barrel shooters of steel and nickel. Yet they had seen his father through his apprenticeship, and his father now ruled, at least in name. Is your need so fearsome, then? Court muttered, as if in his sleep. So pressing. Aye, I feared so. So much need should have made you stupid, and yet you won. The key. The hawk was a fine ploy, a fine weapon. How long did it take you to train the bastard? I never trained David. I friended him. The key. Under my belt, gunslinger. The eye closed again. The gunslinger reached under Court's belt, feeling the heavy press of the man's belly and the huge muscle there now slack and asleep. The key was on a brass ring. He clutched it in his hand, and restraining the mad urge to thrust it up to the sky in a salutation of victory. He got up to his feet and was finally turning to the others when Court's hand fumbled for his foot. For a moment the gunslinger feared some last attack and tensed, but Court only looked up at him and beckoned with one crusted finger. I'm going to sleep now, Court whispered calmly. I'm going to walk the path. Perhaps all the way to the clearing at the end of it, I don't know. I teach you no more, gunslinger. You have surpassed me, and 2 years younger than your father, who was the youngest. But let me counsel. What? Impatiently. Wipe that look off your face, maggot. In his surprise, Roland did as he was bid, although being crouched, hidden behind his face was as we all are, could not know it. Court nodded, then whispered a single word. Wait. What? The effort it took the man speak lent his words great emphasis. Let the word and legend go before you. There are those who will carry both. His eyes flicked over the gunslinger's shoulder. Fools, perchance. Let your shadow grow hair on its face. Let it become dark. He smiled grotesquely. Given time, words may even enchant to enchanter. Do you take my meaning, gunslinger? Yes, I think I do. Will you take my last counsel as your teacher? The gunslinger rocked back on his heels, a hunkered thinking posture that foreshadowed the man. He looked at the sky. It was deepening, purpling. The heat of the day was failing, and thunderheads in the west foretold rain. Lightning tines jabbed at the placid flank of the rising foothills miles distant. Beyond that, the mountains. Beyond that, the rising fountains of blood and unreason. He was tired, tired to his bones and beyond. He looked back at Court. I will bury my hawk tonight, teacher, and later go into the lower town to inform those in the brothels that will wonder about you. Perhaps I will comfort one or two a little. Court's lips parted in a pained smile, and then he slept. The gunslinger got to his feet and turned to the others. Make a litter and take him to his house. Then bring a nurse. No, two nurses, okay? They still watched him, caught in a baited moment that none of them could immediately break. They still looked for a corona of fire or magical change of features. Two nurses, the gunslinger repeated, and then smiled. They smiled in return, nervously. Goddamn horse drover, Cuthbert suddenly yelled, grinning. You haven't left enough meat for the rest of us to pick off his bones. The world won't move on tomorrow, the gunslinger said, quoting the old adage with a smile. Elaine, you butterbutt, move your freight. Elaine set about the business of making the litter. Thomas and Jamie went together to the main hall in the infirmary. The gunslinger and Cuthbert looked at each other. They had always been the closest, or as close as they could be under the particular shades of their characters. There was a speculative, open light in Bert's eyes, and the gunslinger controlled only with great difficulty the need to tell him not to call for the test for a year, or even 18 months, lest he go west. But they had been through the great ordeal together, and the gunslinger did not feel he could risk saying such a thing without a look on his face that might be taken for arrogance. I've begun to scheme, he thought, and was a little dismayed. Then he thought of Martin, of his mother, and he smiled a deceiver's smile at his friend. I am to be the first, he thought, knowing it for the first time, although he had thought of it idly many times before. I am the first. Let's go, he said. With pleasure, gunslinger. They left by the east end of the hedge-bordered corridor. Thomas and Jamie were returning with the nurse already. They looked like ghosts in their white and gauzy summer robes, crossed at the breast with red. Shall I help you with the hawk? Cuthbert asked. Yes, the gunslinger said. That would be lovely, Bert. And later, when darkness had come and the rushing thunder showers with it, while huge phantom occasions rolled across the sky and lightning washed the crooked streets of the lower town in blue fire, while horses stood at hitching rails with their heads down and their tails drooping, the gunslinger took a woman and lay with her. It was quick and good. When it was over, and as they lay side by side without speaking, it began to hail with a brief rattling ferocity. Downstairs and far away, someone was playing Hey Jude ragtime. The gunslinger's mind turned reflectively inward. He was in that hail-splattered silence just before sleep overtook him that he first thought that he might also be the last. The gunslinger didn't tell the boy all of this, but perhaps most of it came through anyway. He had already realized that this was an extremely perceptive boy, not so different from Elaine, who was strong in that half empathy, half telepathy they called the touch. You asleep? The gunslinger asked. No. Did you understand what I told you? Understand it? The boy asked with surprising scorn. Understand it? Are you kidding me? No. But the gunslinger felt defensive. He had never told anyone about his coming of age before because he felt ambivalent about it. Of course, the hawk had been a perfectly acceptable weapon, yet it had been a trick, too, and a betrayal, the first of many. And tell me, am I really preparing to throw this boy at the man in black? I understand it all right, the boy said. It was a game, wasn't it? Do grown-up men always have to play games? Does everything have to be an excuse for another kind of game? Do any men grow up, or do they only come of age? You don't know everything, the gunslinger said, trying to hold his slow anger. You're just a boy. Sure, but I know what I am to you. And what's that? The gunslinger asked tightly. A poker chip. The gunslinger felt an urge to find a rock and brain the boy. Instead, he spoke calmly. Go to sleep. Boys need their sleep. And in his mind, he heard Martin's echo. Go and find your hand. He sat stiffly in the darkness, stunned with horror and terrified. For the first time in his existence, the self-loathing that might come afterward. During the next period of waking, the railway angled closer to the underground river and they came upon the slow mutants. Jake saw the first one and screamed aloud. The gunslinger's head, which had been fixed straight forward as he pumped the handcar, jerked to the right. There was a rotten jack-o'-lantern greenness below them, pulsating faintly. For the first time, he became aware of odor, faint, unpleasant, and wet. The greenness was a face, what might be called a face by one of charitable bent. Above the flattened nose was an insectile node of eyes peering at them expressionlessly. The gunslinger felt an atavistic crawl in his intestines and privates. He stepped up the rhythm of his arms and the handcar handle slightly. The glowing face faded. What the hell was that? The boy asked, crawling to him. What? The words stopped dumb in his throat as they came upon and then past a group of three faintly glowing forms standing between the rails and the invisible river, watching them, motionless. They're slow mutants, the gunslinger said. I don't think they'll bother us. They're probably just as frightened of us as we are of. One of the forms broke free and shambled toward them. The face was that of a starving idiot. The faint, naked body had been transformed into a knotted mess of tentacular limbs and suckers. The boy screamed again and crowded against the gunslinger's leg like a frightened dog. One of the thing's tentacled arms pawed across the flat platform of the handcar. It reeked of the wet and dark. The gunslinger let loose of the handle and drew. He put a bullet through the forehead of the starving idiot face. It fell away, its faint swamp fire glow fading, an eclipsed moon. The gun flash lay bright and branded on their dark retinas, fading only reluctantly. The smell of expended powder was hot and savage and alien in this buried place. There were others, more of them. None moved against them overtly, but they were closing in on the tracks in a silent, hideous party of rubberneckers. You may have to pump for me, the gunslinger said. Can you? Yes. Then be ready. The boy stood close to him, his body poised. His eyes took in the slow mutants only as they passed, not traversing, not seeing more than they had to. The boy assumed a psychic bulge of terror, as if his very id had somehow sprung out through his pores to form a shield. If he had to touch, the gunslinger reasoned, that was not impossible. The gunslinger pumped steadily but did not increase his speed. The slow mutants could smell their terror. He knew that, but he doubted if terror alone would be enough to motivate them. He and the boy were, after all, creatures of the light and whole. How they must hate us, he thought, and wondered if they had hated the man in black in the same way. He thought not, or perhaps he had passed among them only like the shadow of a dark wing in his greater darkness. The boy made a noise in his throat and the gunslinger turned, his head almost casually. Four of them were charging the handcar in a stumbling way, one of them in the process of finding a hand grip. The gunslinger let go of the handle and drew again with the same sleepy casual motion. He shot the lead mutant in the head. The mutant made a sighing, sobbing noise and began to grin. Its hands were limp and fish-like, dead. The fingers clove to one another like the fingers of a glove long immersed in drying mud. One of these corpse hands found the boy's foot and began to pull. The boy shrieked aloud in the granite womb. The gunslinger shot the mutant in the chest, and it began to slobber through the grin. Jake was going off the side. The gunslinger caught one of his arms and was almost pulled off balance himself. The thing was surprisingly strong. The gunslinger put another bullet in the mutant's head. One eye went out like a candle. Still it pulled. They engaged in a silent tug of war for Jake's jerking, wriggling body. The slow mutants yanked on him like a wishbone. The wish would undoubtedly be to dine. The handcar was slowing down. The others began to close in. The lame, the halt, the blind. Perhaps they only looked for a Jesus to heal them, to raise them Lazarus-like from the darkness. It's the end for the boy, the gunslinger thought with perfect coldness. This is the end he meant. Let go and pump, or hold on and be buried. The end for the boy. He gave a tremendous yank on the boy's arm and shot the mutant in the belly. For one frozen moment, its grip grew even tighter, and Jake began to slide off the edge again. Then the dead mud mitts loosened, and the slow mutie fell on its face behind the slowing handcar, still grinning. I thought you'd leave me, the boy was sobbing. I thought, I thought. Hold on to my belt, the gunslinger said. Hold on just as tight as you can. The hand worked into his belt and clutched there. The boy was breathing in his great, convulsive, silent gasps. The gunslinger began to pump steadily again, and the handcar picked up speed. The slow mutants fell back a step and watched them go with faces hardly human, or pathetically so. Faces that generated the weak phosphorance common to those weird deep sea fish that live under incredible black pressure, faces that held no anger or hate, but only what seemed to be a semi conscious idiot regret. They're thinning, the gunslinger said. The drawn up muscles of his lower belly and privates relaxed the smallest bit there. The slow mutants had put rocks across the track. The way was blocked. It had been a quick, poor job, perhaps the work of only a minute or two to clear, but they were stopped, and someone would have to get down and move them. The boy moaned and shuddered closer to the gunslinger. The gunslinger let go of the handle, and the handcar coasted noisily to the rocks where it thumped to a rest. The slow mutants began to close in again, almost casually, almost as if they had been passing by, lost in a dream of darkness, and had found someone of whom to ask directions. The street corner congregation of the damned beneath the ancient rock. Are they going to get us? The boy asked calmly. Never in life. Be quiet a second. He looked at the rocks. The mutants were weak, of course, and had not been able to drag any of the boulders to block their way. Only small rocks. Only enough to stop them, to make someone. Get down, the gunslinger said. You'll have to move them. I'll cover you. No, the boy whispered. Please. I can't give you a gun, and I can't move the rocks and shoot too. You have to get down. Jake's eyes rolled terribly. For a moment, his body shuddered in tune with the turning of his mind. And then he wriggled over the side and began to throw rocks to the right and the left, working with mad speed and not looking up. The gunslinger drew and waited. Two of them, lurching rather than walking, went for the boy with arms like dough. The guns did their work, stitching the darkness with red-white lances of light, and then pushed needles of pain into the gunslinger's eyes. The boy screamed and continued to throw rocks away to either side. Witchglow leaped and danced. Hard to see now. That was the worst. Everything had gone to shadows and after images. One of them, glowing hardly at all, suddenly reached for the boy with rubber boogeyman arms. Eyes that ate up half the mutant's head rolled wetly. Jake screamed again and turned to struggle. The gunslinger fired without allowing himself to think before his spotty vision could betray his hand into a terrible quiver. The two heads were only inches apart. It was the mutie who fell. Jake threw rocks wildly. The mutants milled just outside the invisible line of trespass, closing a little at a time. Now very close. Others had caught up, swelling their number. All right, the gunslinger said. Get on, quick. When the boy moved, the mutants came at them. Jake was over the side and scrambling to his feet. The gunslinger was already pumping again. All out. Both guns were holstered now. They must run. It was their only chance. Strange hands slapped the metal plane of the car's surface. The boy was holding his belt with both hands now, his face pressed tightly into the small of the gunslinger's back. A group of them ran onto the tracks, their faces full of that mindless, casual anticipation. The gunslinger was full of adrenaline. The car was flying alongside the tracks into darkness. They struck the 4 or 5 pitiful hulk full force. They flew like rotten bananas struck from the stem. On, into the soundless, flying, banshee darkness. After an age, the boy raised his face into the Made wind, dreading and yet needing to know. The ghost of gun flashes still lingered on his retinas. There was nothing to see but the darkness, and nothing to hear but the rumble of the river. They're gone, the boy said, suddenly fearing an end to the tracks and the darkness and the wounding crash as they jumped the rails and plunged to twisted ruin. He had ridden in cars. Once his humorless father had driven at 90 on the New Jersey Turnpike and had been stopped by a cop who ignored the 20 Elmer Chambers offered his license and gave him a ticket anyway. But he had never ridden like this, with the wind and the blindness and the terrors behind and ahead, with the sound of the river like a chuckling voice, the voice of the man in black. The gunslinger's arms were pistons in a lunatic human factory. They're gone, the boy said timidly, the words ripped from his mouth by the wind. You can slow down now. We left them behind. But the gunslinger did not hear. They careened onward into the strange dark. They went on for 3 days, without incident. During the fourth period of waking, halfway through, three quarters, they didn't know. Knew only that they weren't tired enough to stop just yet. There was a sharp thump beneath them. The handcar swayed, and their bodies immediately leaned to the right against the gravity as the rails took a gradual turn to the left. There was a light ahead, a glow so faint and alien that it seemed at first to be a totally new element, not earth, air, fire, nor water. It had no color and could only be discerned by the fact that they had regained their hands and faces in the dimension beyond that of touch. Their eyes had become so light sensitive that they noticed the glow more than 5 miles before they approached its source. The end? The boy said tightly. It's the end. No, the gunslinger spoke with odd assurance. It isn't. And it was not. They reached the light, but not day. As they approached the source of the glow, they saw for the first time the rock wall to the left had fallen away and their tracks had been joined by others, which crossed in a complex spider web. The light laid them in burnished vectors. On some of them, there were dark box cars, passenger coaches, a stage that had been adapted to rails. They made the gunslinger nervous, like ghost galleons trapped in an underground Sagrasso. The light grew stronger, hurting their eyes a little, but growing slowly enough to allow them to adapt. They came from the dark to the light like divers coming up from the deep fathoms and slow stages. Ahead, drawing nearer, was a huge hangar stretching up into the dark. Cut into it, showing yellow squares of light, was a series of perhaps 24 entryways growing from the size of toy windows to the height of 20 feet as they drew closer. They passed inside through one of the middle ways. Written above were a series of characters in various languages, the gunslinger presumed. He was astounded to find that he could read the last one. It was an ancient root of high speech, and said, Track 10 to surface and points west. Okay, where did it go? The light inside was brighter. The tracks met and merged through a series of switchings. Here, some of the traffic lanterns still worked, flashing eternal reds and greens and ambers. They rolled between the rising stone piers, caked black with the passage of thousands of vehicles, and they were in some kind of central terminal. The gunslinger let the handcar coast slowly to a stop, and they peered around. It's like a subway, the boy said. Subway? Never mind. You wouldn't know what I was talking about. I don't even know what I'm talking about. Not anymore. The boy climbed up onto the cracked cement. They looked at the silent, deserted booths where newspapers and books had once been traded or sold, a bootery, a weapon shop. The gunslinger, suddenly feverish with excitement, saw revolvers and rifles. Closer inspection showed that their barrels had been filled with lead, and he did, however, pick out a bow, which he slung over his back, and a quiver of almost useless, badly weighted arrows. A woman's apparel shop. Somewhere, a converter was turning the air over and over, and as it had for thousands of years, but perhaps would not for much longer. It had a grating noise somewhere in its cycle which served to remind that perpetual motion, even under strictly controlled conditions, was still a fool's dream. The air had a mechanized taste. The boy's shoes and the gunslinger's boots made flat echoes. The boy cried out, Hey! Hey! The gunslinger turned and went to him. The boy was standing transfixed to the bookstall,
Inside, sprawled on the far corner, was a mummy. He was wearing a blue uniform with gold piping, a tradesman's uniform by the look. There was an ancient, perfectly preserved newspaper on the dead thing's lap, and it crumbled to dust when the gunslinger touched it. The mummy's face was like an old, shriveled apple. Cautiously, the gunslinger touched the cheek. There was a small puff of dust. When it cleared, they were able to look through the flesh and into the mummy's mouth. A gold tooth twinkled there. Gas, the gunslinger murmured. The old people uh made a gas that would do this, or so Renee told us. The one who taught from books. Yes, he. I bet these old people fought wars with it, the boy said darkly. Killed other people with it. I'm sure you're right. There were perhaps a dozen other mummies. All but two or three were wearing the blue and gold ornamental uniforms. The gunslinger supposed the gas had been used when the place was empty of most incoming and outgoing traffic. Perhaps one in the dim ago, the station had been a military objective of some long ago army and cause. That thought depressed him. We better go on, he said, and started toward track 10 and the handcar again. But the boy stood rebelliously behind him. Not going. The gunslinger turned back, surprised. The boy's face was twisted and trembling. You won't get what you want until I'm dead. I'll take my chances by myself. The gunslinger nodded noncommittally, hating himself for what he was going to do. Okay, Jake, he said mildly. Long days, pleasant nights. He turned around, walked across to the stone piers, leaped easily down onto the handcar. You made a deal with someone, the boy screamed after him. I know you did. The gunslinger, not replying, carefully put the bow in front of the T-post rising out of the handcar's floor, out of harm's way. The boy's fists were clenched, his features drawn in agony. How easily you bluff this young boy, the gunslinger told himself. Again and again, his wonderful intuition. His touch has led him to this point, and again, you have led him on past it. And how difficult could it be? After all, he has no friends but you. In a sudden simple thought, almost a vision, it came to him that all he had to do was give it over. Turn around, take the boy with him, and make for the center of a new force. The tower did not have to be obtained in this humiliating, nose-rubbing way, did it? Let his quest resume after the boy had a growth of 10 years, when the two of them could cast the man in black aside like a cheap wind-up toy. Surely, he thought cynically, surely. He knew with sudden coldness that turning back would mean death for the both of them. Death or worse, entombment with the slow muties behind them, decay of all the faculties, with perhaps the guns of his father living on long after both of them, kept in rotten splendor as totems not unlike the forgotten gas pump. Show some guts, he told himself falsely. He reached for the handle and began to pump. The handcar moved away from the stone piers. The boy screamed, "Wait!" and began running on the diagonal toward the handcar, toward where the handcar would emerge near the darkness ahead. The gunslinger had an impulse to speed up, to leave the boy alone, yet at least with an uncertainty. Instead, he caught him as he leaped. The heart beneath the thin shirt thrummed and fluttered as Jake clung to him. The end was very close now. The sound of the river had become very loud, filling even their dreams with its thunder. The gunslinger, more as a whim than anything else, let the boy pump them ahead while he shot a number of the bad arrows, tethered by fine white lengths of thread, into the dark. The boy was also very bad. The bow was also very bad, incredibly preserved, but with a terrible pull and aim despite that, and the gunslinger knew nothing would improve it. Even restringing would not help the tired wood. The arrows would not fly far into the dark, but the last one he sent out came back wet and slick. The gunslinger only shrugged when the boy asked him how far to the water, but privately, he didn't think the arrow could have traveled more than 60 yards from the rotted bow, and lucky to get that far. And still the river's thunder grew louder and closer. During the third waking period after the station, a spectral radiance began to grow again. They had entered a long tunnel of some weird phosphorescent rock, and the wet walls glittering and twinkled with thousands of minute starbursts. The boy called them voxels. They saw things in a kind of eerie horror house surreality. The root sound of the river was channeled to them by the confining rock, magnified in its own natural amplifier. Yet the sound remained oddly constant. Even as they approached the crossing point, the gunslinger was sure lay ahead, because the walls were widening and drawing back. The angle of their ascent became more pronounced. The tracks arrowed through the new light. To the gunslinger, the clumps of fossils looked like the captive tubes of swamp gas sometimes sold for a pretty at the feast of the Reaptide Fair. To the boy, they looked like endless streamers of neon tubing. But in its glow, they could both see that the rock had enclosed them so long ended up ahead in ragged twin peninsulas that pointed toward a gulf of darkness. The chasm over the river. The chasm over the river. The tracks continued out and over the unknowable drop supported by a trestle aeons old, and beyond what seemed an incredible distance was a tiny pinprick of light, not phosphorescence or fluorescence, but the hard, true light of day. It was as tiny as a needle prick in the dark cloth, yet weighted with frightful meaning. Stop, the boy said. Stop for a minute, please. Unquestioning, the gunslinger let the handcar coast to a stop. The sound of the river was steady, booming roar coming from beneath and ahead. The artificial glow from the wet rock was suddenly hateful. For the first time, he felt a claustrophobic hand touch him, and the urge to get out, to get free of this living burial, was strong and nearly undeniable. We'll go on, the boy said. Is that what he wants? For us to drive the handcar out over that and fall down? The gunslinger knew it was not, but said, I don't know what he wants. They got down and approached the lip of the drop carefully. The stone beneath their feet continued to rise until, with a sudden, angling drop, the floor fell away from the tracks, and the tracks continued alone across the blackness. The gunslinger dropped to his knees and peered down. He could dimly make out a complex, nearly incredible webwork of steel girders and struts disappearing down toward the roar of the river, all in support of the graceful arc of the track across the void. In the mind's eye, he could imagine the work of time and water on the steel in deadly tandem. How much support was left? Little? Hardly any? None? He suddenly saw the face of the mummy again, and the way the flesh, seemingly solid, had crumbled to powder at the effortless touch of his finger. We'll walk now, the gunslinger said. He half expected the boy to balk again, but he preceded the gunslinger out onto the rails, crossing on the welded steel slats calmly with sure feet. The gunslinger followed him out over the chasm, ready to catch him if Jake should put a foot wrong. The gunslinger felt a fine slick of sweat cover his skin. The trestle was rotten, very rotten. It thrummed beneath his feet, with heady motion of the river far beneath, swaying a little on unseen guy wires. We're acrobats, he thought. Look, Mother, no net. I'm flying. He knelt once and examined the cross ties they were walking on. They were cracked and pitted with rust. He could feel the reason on his face. Fresh air, the friend of corruption. They must be very close to the surface now, and a strong blow of the fist made the metal quiver sickly. Once he heard a warning groan beneath his feet and felt the steel settle preparatory to giving way, but he had already moved on. The boy, of course, was over 100 pounds lighter and safe enough, unless the going became progressively worse. Behind them, the handcar had melted into the general gloom. The stone pier on the left extended out perhaps 20 yards. It jutted further than the one on the right, but this was also left behind, and then they were alone over the gulf. At first it seemed that the tiny prick of daylight remained mockingly constant, perhaps even drawing away from them at the exact pace they approached it. They would be a fine bit of magic indeed, but gradually the gunslinger realized that it was widening, becoming more defined. They were still below it, but the tracks were rising to meet it. The boy gave a surprised grunt and suddenly lurched to the side, arms pinwheeling in slow, wide revolutions. It seemed that he tottered to the brink of a very on the brink for a very long time indeed before stepping forward again. "You'd almost win on me," he said softly, without emotion. "There's a hole. Step over it if you don't want to take a quick trip to the bottom. Simon says take one giant step." That was a game the gunslinger knew, his mother says, remembered well from childhood games with Cuthbert, Jamie, and Elaine. But he said nothing, only stepped over. "Go back," Jake said, unsmiling. "You forgot to say may I. Cry your pardon, but I think not." The cross tie the boy had stepped on had given way almost entirely and flopped downward lazily, swinging on a rotten rivet. Upward, still upward, it was a nightmare walk, and so seemed to go on much longer than it did. The air itself seemed to thicken and become like taffy, and the gunslinger felt as if he might be swimming rather than walking. Again and again his mind tried to turn itself to thoughtful, lunatic consideration of the awful space between this trestle and the river below. His brain viewed it in spectacular detail, and how it would be, the scream of twisting, giving metal, the lurching as his body slid off to the side, the grabbing of non existent handholds with his fingers, and the swift rattle of boot heels on treacherous rotted steel, and then down, turning over and over. A warm spray in his crotch as the bladder let go, and the rush of wind against his face rippling his hair up in a caricature of fright, pulling his eyelids back, the dark water rushing to meet him. Faster, outri- outstripping even his own scream. Metal screamed beneath him, and he stepped past it unhurriedly, shifting his weight. At that crucial moment, not thinking of the drop or how far they had come, or of how far might be left, not thinking that the boy was expendable and that the sale of his honor was now, at last, nearly negotiable. What a relief it would be when the deal was done. "Three ties out," the boy said coolly. "I'm gonna jump. Here, right here. Geronimo!" The gunslinger saw him silhouetted for a moment against the daylight, in awkward, hunched, spread eagle arms out as if, should all else fail, there was the possibility of flight. He landed, and the whole edifice swayed debunkedly under his weight. Metal beneath them protested, and something far below fell, first with a crash, then with a splash. "Are you over?" the gunslinger asked. "Yar," the boy said, "but it's very rotten. Like the ideas of certain people, maybe. I don't think it will hold you any further than where you are now. Me, but not you. Go back. Go back now and leave me alone." His voice was cold, but there was hysteria underneath, beating in his heart, um, beating as his heart beat when he jumped back onto the hand car, and Roland had caught him. The gunslinger stepped over the brake. One large step did it. One giant step. "Mother, may I?" "Yes, you may." The boy was shuddering helplessly. "Go back. I don't want you to kill me." "For the love of the man Jesus, walk," the gunslinger said roughly. "It's going to fall down for sure if we stand here palavering." The boy walked drunkenly now, his hands held out shudderingly before him, fingers splayed, and they went up. Yes, it was much, much more rotten now. There were frequent breaks of one, two, even three ties. The gunslinger expected again and again that they would find the long empty spaces between rails that would either force them back or make them walk on the rails themselves, balanced giddily over the chasm. He kept his eyes fixed on the daylight. The glow had taken on a color, blue. As it came closer, it became softer, paling the radiance of the fossils 50 yards, or 100 still to cover, he could not say. They walked, and now he looked at his feet crossing from tie to tie. When he looked up again, the glow ahead had grown to a hole. And it was not just light, but a way out. They were almost there. 30 yards now, no more than that. 90 short feet. It could be done. Perhaps they would have the man in black yet. Perhaps in the bright sunlight, the evil flowers in his mind would shrivel and anything would be possible. The sunlight was blocked out. He looked up, startled, peering like a mole from its hole, and saw a silhouette filling the light, eating it up, allowing only chinks of mocking blue around the outline of the shoulders and the fork of crotch. "Hello, boys." The man in black's voice echoed to them, amplified in the natural throat of stone, the sarcasm of his good cheer taking on mighty undertones. Blindly, the gunslinger sought the jawbone, but it was gone, lost somewhere, used up. He laughed above them, and the sound crashed around them, reverberating like surf in a filling cave. The boy screamed and tottered, a windmill again, arms gyrating through the scant air. Metal ripped and sloughed between them. The rails canted through a slow and dreamy twisting. The boy plunged, and one hand flew up like a goal in the darkness, up, up, and then hung over the pit. He dangled there, his dark eyes staring up at the gunslinger, his final blind, lost knowledge. "Help me." Booming, racketing, no more games. Come now, gunslinger, or catch me never. All the chips on the table, every card but one, the boy dangled. A living tarot card. The hanged man, the Phoenician sailor, innocent lost and barely above the wave of a Stygian sea. Wait then, wait a while. Do I go? His voice is so loud he makes it hard to think. Help me, Roland. The trestle had begun to twist further, screaming, pulling loose from itself, giving. Then I shall leave you. No, you shall not! The gunslinger's legs carried him in a sudden leap, breaking the paralysis that held him. He took a true giant step above the dangling boy and landed in a skidding, plunging rush toward the light that offered the tower, frozen on his mind's eye in a black still life, into sudden silence. The silhouette was gone, even the beat of his heart was gone as the trestle settled further, beginning its final slow dance to the depths, tearing loose his hands, finding the rocky, lighted lip of damnation, and behind him, in the dreadful silence, the boy spoke from too far beneath him. Go then. There are other worlds than these. Then the trestle tore away, and the whole weight of it, as the gunslinger pulled himself up and through to the light and the breeze and the reality of a new caw. He twisted his head back for a moment in his agony, striving to be Janus, but there was nothing, only plummeting silence, for the boy made no cry as he fell. Then Roland was up, pulling himself onto the rocky escapement that looked toward a grassy plain, toward where the man in black stood, spread-legged, with arms crossed. The gunslinger stood drunkenly, pallid as a ghost, eyes huge and swimming beneath his forehead, shirt smeared with white dust of his final, lunging crawl. It came to him that there would be further degradations of the spirit ahead that might make this one seem infinitesimal, and yet he would still flee it. Down corridors and through cities, from bed to bed, he would flee the boy's face and try to bury it in the cunts and killings, only to enter one final room and find it looking at him over a candle flame. He had become the boy, and the boy had become him. He was become a werewolf of his own making. In deep dreams, he would become the boy and speak the boy's strange city tongue. This is death, is it? Is it? He walked slowly, drunkenly down the rocky hill toward where the man in black waited. Here the tracks had been worn away under the sun of reason, and it was as if they had never been. The man in black pushed his hood away with the backs of both his hands, laughing. "So," he cried, "not an end, but the end of the beginning, eh? You progress, gunslinger, you progress. Oh, how I admire you." The gunslinger drew with blinding speed and fired 12 times. The gun flashes dimmed the sun itself, and the pounding of the explosions slammed back from the rock faced escapements behind them. Now, now, the man in black said, laughing. Oh, now, now, now. We make great magic together, you and I. You kill me no more than you kill yourself. He withdrew, walking backwards, facing the gunslinger, grinning and beckoning. Come, come, come. Mother, may I? Yes, you may. The gunslinger followed him in broken boots to the palace of counseling. And chapter 5 is called The Gunslinger and the Man in Black. Give me 1 second though, because I am out of water and I do need to replace that. My apologies. All right, I am back, but before I continue, I am going to take a hit and a drink and all that good stuff because I can. And you guys can tell me how you're liking the story so far. I like reading your theories. That is fun. I cannot participate in your theories. I can only enjoy you guys sharing your theories because, of course, this is not my first time through the series. So I don't get to participate in your speculation, but I really enjoy reading your speculations. So that is pretty cool. Um all right. This is obviously going to be a super short chapter because the gunslinger's talking to the man in black, and we can't know too much about him in book 1, can we? All right. The man in black led him to an ancient killing ground to make palaver. The gunslinger knew it immediately, a Golgotha, place of the skull. And bleached skulls stared blandly up at them. Cattle, coyotes, deer, rabbits, bumbler. Here the alabaster xylophone of a hen pheasant killed as she fed. There the tiny delicate bones of a mole, perhaps killed for pleasure by a wild dog. The Golgotha was a bowl indented into the descending slope of the mountain, and below, in easier altitudes, the gunslinger could see Joshua trees and scrub firs. The sky overhead was a softer blue than he had seen for 12 months, and there was an indefinable something that spoke of the sea in the not too great distance. I am in the west, Cuthbert, he thought wonderingly. If this is not Midworld, it's close by. The man in black sat on an ancient ironwood log. His boots were powdered white with dust and the uneasy bone meal of this place. He had put his hood up against it. He had put his hood up again, but the gunslinger could see the square shape of his chin clearly and the shading of his jaw. The shadowed lips twitched in a smile. Gather wood, Gunslinger. This side of the mountain is gentle, but at this altitude, the cold still may put a knife in one's belly. And this is a place of death, eh? I'll kill you, the gunslinger said. No, you won't. You can't. But you can gather wood to remember your Isaac. The gunslinger had no understanding of the reference. He went wordlessly and gathered wood like a common cook's boy. The pickings were slim. There was no devil's grass on this side, and the ironwood would not burn. It had, it had become stone. He returned finally with a large armload of likely sticks, powdered and dusted with disintegrated bone as if dipped in flour. The sun had sunk low beyond the highest Joshua trees and had taken on a reddish glow. It peered at them with baleful indifference. Excellent, the man in black said. How exceptional you are! How methodical! How resourceful! I salute you. He giggled, and the gunslinger dropped to the wood at his feet with a crash that ballooned up bone dust. The man in black did not start or jump, he merely began laying the fire. The gunslinger watched, fascinated, as the ideogram, fresh this time, took shape. When it finished, it resembled a small and complex double chimney about 2 feet high. The man in black lifted his hand skyward, shaking back the voluminous sleeve from a tapered, handsome hand, and brought it down rapidly, index and pinky finger forked out in the traditional sign of the evil eye. There was a blue flash of flame, and their fire was lighted. I have matches, the man in black said jovially, but I thought you might enjoy the magic for a pretty gunslinger. Now cook our dinner. The folds of his robe shivered, and the plucked and gutted carcass of a plump rabbit fell on the dirt. The gunslinger spitted the rabbit wordlessly and roasted it. The savory smell drifted up as the sun went down. Purple shadows. Dang it! My mouth is dry and I'm getting tongue tied. Where'd I put my water? Okay, where did I go? Purple shadows drifted hungrily over the bowl where the man in black had chosen to finally face him. The gunslinger felt hunger begin to rumble endlessly in his belly as the rabbit browned. But when the meat was cooked and its juices sealed in, he handed the entire skewer wordlessly to the man in black, rummaged in his own nearly flat knapsack, and withdrew the last of his jerky. It was salty, painful to his mouth, and tasted like tears. That's a worthless gesture, the man in black said, managing to sound angry and amused at the same time. Nevertheless, the gunslinger said, there were tiny sores in his mouth, the result of vitamin deprivation. The salt taste made him grin bitterly. Are you afraid of enchanted meat? Yes, indeed. The man in black slipped his hood back. The gunslinger looked at him silently. In a way, the face that the hood had hidden was an uneasy disappointment. It was handsome and regular, with none of the marks and twists which indicate a man who has been through awesome times and is privy to great secrets. His hair was black and of ragged and matted length. His forehead was high, his eyes dark and brilliant. His nose was nondescript. The lips were full and sensual, and his complexion was pallid, as was the gunslinger's own. The gunslinger said finally, I expected an older man. Why? I am nearly immortal, as are you, Roland. For now, at least. I could have taken a face with which you would have been more familiar, but I elected to show you the one I was, the born with. See, gunslinger, the sunset. The sun had departed already, and the western sky was filled with sullen furnace light. You won't see another sunrise for what may seem a very long time, the man in black said. The gunslinger remembered the pit under the mountains and then looked at the sky, where the constellations sprawled in clock spring profusion. Doesn't matter, he said softly. Now. The man in black shuffled the cards with flying hands. The deck was huge, the design on the back convoluted. These are tarot cards, gunslinger, of a sort. Mixture of the standard deck to which have been added a selection of my own development. Now watch carefully. What will I watch? I'm going to tell your future. 7 cards must be turned one at a time and placed in conjunction with the others. I've not done this since the days of Gilead, when since the days when Gilead stood and the ladies played at points on the west lawn, and I suspect I've never read a tale such as yours. Mockery was creeping into his voice again. You are the world's last adventurer, the last crusader. How that must please you, Roland. Yet, you have no idea how close you stand to the tower now as you resume your quest. Worlds turn about your head. What do you mean, resume? I never left off. At this, the man in black laughed heartily, but would not say what he found so funny. Read my fortune, then, Roland said, harshly. The first card was turned. The hanged man, the man in black said. The darkness had given him back his hood. Yet here in conjunction with nothing else, it signifies strength, not death. You, Gunslinger, are the hanged man, plodding ever onward toward your goal over the pits of Nar. You've already dropped one co-traveler into that pit, have you not? The gunslinger said nothing, and the second card was turned. The sailor. Note the clear brow, the hairless cheeks, the wounded eyes. He drowns, Gunslinger, and no one throws out the line. The boy, Jake. The gunslinger winced, said nothing. The third card was turned. A baboon stood, grinning astride a young man's shoulders. The young man's face was turned up, a grimace of stylized dread and horror on his features. Looking more closely, the gunslinger saw the baboon held a whip. The prisoner, the man in black said. The fire cast uneasy, flickering shadows over the face of the ridden man, making it seem to move and writhe in wordless terror. The gunslinger flicked his eyes away. Trifle upsetting, isn't it? The man in black said, and seemed on the verge of snickering. He turned the fourth card. A woman with a shawl over her head sat spinning at a wheel. To the gunslinger's dazed eyes, she appeared to be smiling craftily and sobbing at the same time. The Lady of the Shadows, the man in black remarked. Does she look two-faced to you, Gunslinger? She is. 2 faces at least. She broke the blue plate. What do you mean? I don't know. And in this case, at least, the gunslinger thought his adversary was telling the truth. His adversary. Sorry. Wrong line. Why are you showing me these? Don't ask, the man in black said sharply. Yet he smiled. Don't ask, merely watch. Consider this only pointless ritual, if it eases you and cools you to do so, like church. He tittered and turned the 5th card. A grinning reaper clutched a scythe with bony fingers. Death, the man in black said simply. Yet not for you. The 6th card. The gunslinger looked at it and felt a strange, crawling anticipation in his guts. The feeling was mixed with horror and joy, and the whole of the emotion was unnameable. It made him feel like throwing up and dancing at the same time. The tower, the man in black said softly. Here is the tower. The gunslinger's card occupied the center of the pattern. Each of the following 4 stood at one corner, like satellites circling a star. Where does that one go? The gunslinger asked. The man in black placed the tower over the hanged man, covering it completely. What does that mean? The gunslinger asked. The man in black did not answer. What does that mean? He asked raggedly. The man in black still did not answer. God damn you! No answer. Then be damned to you. What's the 7th card? The man in black turned the 7th.
The sun rose in a luminously blue sky. Cupids and sprites sported around it. Below the sun was a great red field upon which it shone. Roses or blood? The gunslinger could not tell. Perhaps, he thought, it's both. The seventh card is life, the man in black said softly. But not for you. Where does it fit the pattern? This is not for you to know now, the man in black said, or for me to know. I am not the great one you seek, Roland. I am merely his emissary. He flipped the card carelessly into the dying fire. It charred, curled, and flashed to flame. The gunslinger felt his heart quail and turn icy in his chest. Sleep now, the man in black said carelessly. Perchance to dream, and that sort of thing. What my bullets won't do, mayhap my hands will, the gunslinger said, his legs coiled with savage, splendid suddenness, and he flew across the fire at the other, arms outstretched. The man in black smiling swelled in his vision and then retreated down a long and echoing corridor, the world filled with sound of sardonic laughter. He was falling, dying, sleeping. He dreamed. The universe was void. Nothing moved. Nothing was. The gunslinger drifted, bemused. Let's have a little light. The voice of the man in black said nonchalantly, and there was light. The gunslinger thought in a detached way that light was pretty good. Now darkness overhead with stars in it, water down below. It happened. He drifted over endless seas. Above the stars twinkled endlessly, yet he saw none of the constellations which had guided him across his long life. Land. The man in black invited, and there was. It heaved itself out of the water in endless galvanic convolutions. It was red, arid, cracked, and glazed with sterility. Volcanoes blurted endless magma like giant pimples on some ugly adolescent's baseball head. Okay, the man in black was saying, that's a start. Let's have some plants, trees, grass, and fields. There was. Dinosaurs rambled here and there, growling and woofing and eating each other and getting stuck in bumbling, odoriferous tar pits. Huge tropical rainforests sprawled everywhere. Giant ferns waved at the sky with serrated leaves. Beetles with two heads crawled on some of them. All this the gunslinger saw, and yet he felt big. Now bring man, the man in black said softly, but the gunslinger was falling, falling up. The horizon of this vast and fecund earth began to curve. Yes, they had all said it curved. His teacher Vinay had claimed it had been proven long before the world had moved on, but this, further and further, higher and higher. Continents took shape before his amazed eyes and were obscured with clock springs of clouds. The world's atmospheres held it in a placental sack, and the sun rising beyond the earth's shoulder. He cried out and threw an arm before his eyes. Let there be light. The voice no longer belonged to the man in black. It was gigantic, echoing. It filled space and the spaces between space. Light, falling, falling. The sun shrank. A red planet stamped with candles whirled past him, two moons circling it furiously. Beyond this was a whirling belt of stones and a gigantic planet that seethed with gases, too huge to support itself, oblate in consequence. Further out was a ringed world that glittered like a precious gem within its engirdlement of icy spicules. Light, let there be other worlds, one, two, three, far beyond the last. One lonely ball of ice and a rock twirled in dead darkness about a sun that glittered no brighter than a tarnished penny. Beyond this darkness, no, the gunslinger said, and his word was flat and echoless in the black. It was darker than dark and blacker than black. Beside this darkest night of a man's soul was as noonday. The darkness under the mountains a mere smudge on the face of light. No more. Please, no more. Now, no more. Light. No more. No more. Please. The two stars themselves began to shrink.
whole nebulas drew together and became glowing smudges. The whole universe seemed to be drawing around him. Please, no more, no more, no more. The voice of the man in black whispered silkily in his ear. Then renege. Cast away all thoughts of the tower. Go your way, gunslinger, and begin the long job of saving your soul. He gathered himself, shaken and alone, enwrapped in the darkness, terrified of an ultimate meaning rushing at him. He gathered himself and uttered the final answer on that subject. Never. Then let there be light. And there was light, crashing in on him like a hammer, a great and primordial hammer. Consciousness had no chance of survival in the great glare, but before it perished, the gunslinger saw something clearly, something he believed to be of cosmic importance. He clutched it with agonized efforts, and then went deep, seeking refuge in himself, before that light should blind his eyes and blast his sanity. He fled the light and the knowledge of the light implied, and so came back to himself. Even so, do the rest of us, even so, the best of us. It was still night. Whether the same or another, he had no immediate way of knowing. He pushed himself up um, from where his demon spring at the man in black had carried him, and looked at the ironwood where Walter O'Dim, as some long ago Roland Way had named him, had been sitting. He was gone. A great sense of despair flooded him. God, all that to do over again. And then the man in black said from far behind him, Over here, gunslinger. I don't like you so close. You talk in your sleep, he tittered. The gunslinger got groggily to his knees and turned around. The fire had burned down to red embers and gray ashes, leaving the familiar decayed pattern of exhausted fuel. The man in black was seated next to him, smacking his lips with unlovely enthusiasm over the greasy remains of the rabbit. You did fairly well, the man in black said. I never could have sent that vision to your father. He would have come back drooling. What was it? The gunslinger asked. His words were blurred and shaky. He felt that if he tried to rise, his legs would buckle. The universe, the man in black said carelessly. He burped and threw his bones into the fire where they first glittered and then blackened. The wind above the cup of the Golgotha keened and moaned. Universe? The gunslinger said blankly. It was a word with which he was unfamiliar. His first thought was that the other was speaking poetry. You want the tower, the man in black said. It seemed to be a question. Yes. Well, you shan't have it, the man in black said, and smiled with bright cruelty. No one cares in the councils of the great if you pawn your soul or sell it outright, Roland. I have an idea of how close to the edge that last pushed you. The tower will kill you, half a world away. You know nothing of me, the gunslinger said quietly, and the smile faded from the other's lips. I made your father, and I broke him, the man in black said grimly. I came to your mother as Martin. There's a truth you always suspected, is it not? And took her. She bent beneath me like a willow. Although this may comfort you, she never broke. In any case, it was written, and it was. I am the furthest minion of he who now rules the Dark Tower, and earth has been given unto that king's red hand. Red. Why do you say red? Never mind. We'll not speak of him, although you'll learn more than you cared to if you press on. What hurt you once will hurt you twice. This is not the beginning, but the beginning's end. You'd do well to remember that, but you never do. I don't understand. No, you don't. You never did. You never will. You have no imagination. You're blind that way. What did I see? The gunslinger asked. What did I see at the end? What was it? What did it seem to be? The gunslinger was silent, thoughtful. He felt for his tobacco, but there was none. The man in black did not offer to refill his poke by either black magic or white. Later he might find more in his grow bag, but later seemed very far away now. There was light, the gunslinger said finally. Great white light, and then he broke off and stared at the man in black. He was leaning forward, and an alien emotion was stamped on his face, writ too large for lies or denial. It was awe or wonder. Perhaps they were the same. You don't know, he said, and began to smile. Oh, great sorcerer who brings the dead to life, you don't know. You're a fake. I know, the man in black said, but I don't know what. White light, the gunslinger repeated, and then a blade of grass, one single blade of grass that filled everything, and I was tiny, infinitesimal. Grass. The man in black closed his eyes. His face looked drawn and haggard. A blade of grass. Are you sure? Yes, the gunslinger frowned. But it was purple. Hear me now, Roland, son of Stephen. Would you hear me? Yes. And so the man in black began to speak. The universe, he said, is the great all, and offers a paradox too great for the finite mind to grasp. As the living brain cannot conceive of a non living brain, although it may think it can, the finite mind cannot grasp the infinite. The prosaic fact of the universe's existence alone defeats both the pragmatist and the romantic. There was a time, yet hundreds of generations before the world moved on, when mankind had achieved enough technical and scientific prowess to chip a few splinters from the great stone pillar of reality. Even so, the false light of science, knowledge, if you like, shone in only a few developed countries. One company, or cabal, led the way in this regard. North Central Positonics, it called itself. Yet, despite a tremendous increase in available facts, there were remarkably few insights. Gunslinger. Our many times great grandfathers conquered the disease which rots, which they called cancer, almost conquered aging, walked on the moon. I don't believe that, the gunslinger said flatly. To this, the man in black merely smiled and answered, You needn't. Yet it was so. They made or discovered 100 other marvelous baubles, but this wealth of information produced little or no insight. There was no great odes written to the wonders of artificial insemination, having babies from frozen man sperm, or to the cars that ran on power from the sun. Few, if any, seem to have grasped the truest principle of reality. New knowledge leads always to yet more awesome mysteries. Greater physiological knowledge of the brain makes the existence of the soul less possible, yet more probable by the nature of the search. Do you see? Of course you don't. You've reached the limits of your ability to comprehend, but never mind, that's besides the point. What is the point then? The greatest mystery the universe offers is not life, but size. Size encompasses life, and the tower encompasses size. The child, who is most at home with wonder, says, Daddy, what is above the sky? And the father says, The darkness of space. The child, what is beyond space? The father, the galaxy. The child, beyond the galaxy. And the father says, Another galaxy. The child, beyond the other galaxies. The father, No one knows. You see, size defeats us. For the fish, the lake in which he lives is the universe. What does the fish think when he is jerked up by the mouth through the silver limits of existence and into a new universe where the air drowns him and the light is blue madness, where the huge bipeds with no gills stuff it into a suffocating box and cover it with wet weeds to die? Or one might take a trip of a pencil and magnify it. One reaches the point where a stunning realization strikes home. The pencil tip is not solid. It is composed of atoms which whirl and revolve like a trillion demon planets. What seems solid to us is actually only a loose net held together by gravity. Viewed at their actual size, the distances between these atoms might become leagues, gulfs, aeons. The atoms themselves are composed of nuclei and revolving protons and electrons. One might step down further to subatomic particles and then to what? Tachyons? Nothing? Of course not. Everything in the universe denies nothing. To suggest an ending is only one absurdity. If you fell outward to the limit of the universe, would you find a board fence and signs reading dead end? No. You might find something hard and rounded, as the chick must see the egg from the inside, and if you should peek through that shell or find a door, what great and torrential light might shine through your opening at the end of space? Might you look through and discover our entire universe is but part of one atom on a blade of grass? Might you be forced to think that by burning a twig, you incinerate an eternity of eternities? That existence rises not to one infinite, but to an infinity of them? Perhaps you saw what place our universe plays in the scheme of things is no more than an atom in a blade of grass. Could it be that everything we can perceive, from the microscopic virus to the distant Horsehead Nebula, is contained in one blade of grass that may have existed for only a single season in an alien time flow? What if that blade should be cut off by a sky? When it begins to die, would the rot seep into our own universe and our lives, turning everything yellow and brown and desiccated? Perhaps it's already begun to happen. We say the world has moved on. Maybe we really mean that it has begun to dry up. Think how small such concepts of things make us, Gunslinger. If a god watches over it all, if a god watches over it all, does he actually mete out justice for a race of gnats among an infinitude of races of gnats? Does his eye see the sparrow fall when the sparrow is less than a speck of a hydrogen floating disconnected in the depths of space? And if he does, what must the nature of such a god be? Where does he live? How is it possible to live beyond infinity? Imagine the sand of the Mohaine Desert which you crossed to find me, and imagine a trillion universes, not worlds, but universes encapsulated in each grain of that desert, and within each universe, an infinity of others. We tower over these universes from our pitiful grass vantage point. With one swing of your boot, you may knock a billion worlds flying off into darkness in a chain never to be completed. Sighs, Gunslinger. Sighs. Yet suppose further, suppose that all worlds, all universes met in a single nexus, a single pylon, a tower, and within it, a stairway, perhaps rising to the Godhead itself. Would you dare climb to the top, Gunslinger? Could it be that somewhere above all the endless reality, there exists a room? You dare not. And in the Gunslinger's minds, those words echoed. You dare not. Someone has dared, the Gunslinger said. Who would that be? God, the Gunslinger said softly. His eyes gleamed. God has dared. Or the king you spoke of, or is the room empty, seer? I don't know. Fear passed over the man in black's bland face, as soft and dark as a buzzard's wing. And furthermore, I don't ask. It might be unwise. Afraid of being struck dead. Perhaps afraid of an accounting. The man in black was silent for a while. The night was very long. The Milky Way sprawled above them in great splendor, yet terrifying in the emptiness between its burning laps. The Gunslinger wondered what he would feel if that inky sky should split open and let in a torrent of light. The fire, he said. I'm cold. Build it up yourself, said the man in black. It's the butler's night off. The Gunslinger drowsed a while and awoke to see the man in black regarding him avidly, unhealthily. What are you staring at? An old saying of courts occurred to him. Do you see your sister's bum? I'm staring at you, of course. Well, don't. He poked up the fire, ruining the precision of the ideogram. I don't like it. He looked to the east to see if there was a beginning of light. But this night went on and on. You seek the light so soon. I was made for light. Ah, so you were. And so impolite of me to forget that fact. Yet we have much to discuss yet, you and I. For so has it been told to me by my king and master. Who is the king? The man in black smiled. Shall we tell the truth then, you and I? No more lies. I thought we had been. But the man in black persisted as if Roland hadn't spoke. Shall there be truth between us as two men, not as friends but as equals? There is an offer you will get rarely, Roland. Only equals speak the truth. That's my thought on it. Friends and lovers lie endlessly caught in the web of regard. How tiresome. Well, I wouldn't want to tire you, so let us speak the truth. He had never spoken less on this night. Start by telling me what exactly you mean by glamour. Why, enchantment, Gunslinger. My king's enchantment has prolonged this night and will prolong it until our palaver is done. How long would that be? Long. I can tell you no better. I do not know myself. The man in black stood over the fire, and the glowing embers made patterns on his face. Ask. I will tell you what I know. You have caught me. It is fair. I did not think you would. Your quest has only begun. Ask. It will lead us to business soon enough. Who is your king? I've never seen him, but you must. But before you meet him, you must first meet the ageless stranger. The man in black smiled spitelessly. You must slay him, Gunslinger. Yet, I think it is not what you wish to ask. If you've ever seen your king and master, how do you know him? He comes to me in dreams. As a stripling, he came to me when I lived poor and unknown in a far land. A chief of centuries ago, he imbued me with my duty and promised me my reward. Although there were many errands in my youth and the days of my manhood before my apotheosis. You are that apotheosis, Gunslinger. You are my climax, he tittered. You see, someone has taken you seriously. And this stranger, does he have a name? Oh, he is named. And what is his name? Legion, the man in black said softly, and somewhere in the easterly darkness where the mountains lay, a rockside punctuated his words. And a puma screamed like a woman. The gunslinger shivered, and the man in black flinched. Yet I do not think this is what you wish to ask either. It is not in your nature to think so far ahead. The gunslinger knew the question. It had gnawed at him all this night, and he thought for years before. It trembled on his lips, but he didn't ask it. Not yet. This stranger is a minion of the tower, like yourself? Yar, he darkles, he tinks. He is in all times, yet there is one greater than me. Who? Ask me no more, the man in black cried. His voice aspired to sternness and crumbled into beseechment. I know not. I do not wish to know. To speak of things in end world is to speak of the ruination of one's own soul. And beyond the ageless stranger is the tower and whatever the tower contains? Yes, whispered the man in black. But none of these things are what you wish to ask. True. All right, the gunslinger said, and then asked the world's oldest question. Will I succeed? Will I win through? If I answer that question, gunslinger, you'd kill me. I ought to kill you. You need killing. His hands dropped to the worn butts of his gun. Those do not open doors, gunslinger. Those only close them forever. Where must I go? Start west. Go to the sea. Where the world ends is where you must begin. There was a man who gave you advice. The man you bested so long ago. Yes, court, the gunslinger interrupted impatiently. The advice was to wait. It was bad advice, for even then my plans against your father had proceeded. He sent you away, and when you returned, I'd not hear you speak of that, the gunslinger said, and in his mind he heard his mother singing, Baby bunting, baby dear, baby bring your basket here. Then hear this. When you returned, Martin had gone west to join the rebels. So all said anyway, and so you believed. Yet he and a certain witch left you a trap, and you fell into it. Good boy. And although Martin was long gone by then, there was a man who sometimes made you think of him, was there not? A man who affected the dress of a monk and the shaven head of a penitent. Walter, the gunslinger whispered. And although he had come so far in his musings, the bald truth still amused him. You. Martin never left at all. The man in black tittered. At your service. I ought to kill you now. That would hardly be fair. Besides, all of that was long ago. Now comes the time of sharing. You never left, the gunslinger repeated, stunned. You only changed. Sit, the man in black invited. I'll tell you stories, as many as you would hear. Your own stories, I think, will be much longer. I don't talk of myself, the gunslinger muttered. Yet tonight you must, so that we may understand. Understand what? My purpose. You know that. To find the tower is my purpose. I'm sworn. Not your purpose, gunslinger. Your mind. Your slow, prodding, tenacious mind. There has never been one quite like it in all the history of the world, perhaps in the history of creation. This is the time of speaking. This is the time of histories. Then speak. The man in black shook the voluminous arm of his robe. A foil wrapped package fell out and caught the dying embers in many reflective folds. Tobacco, gunslinger. Would you smoke? He had been able to resist the rabbit, but he could not resist this. He opened the foil with eager fingers. This was fine crumbled tobacco inside, green leaves to wrap it in, amazingly moist. He had not seen such tobacco for 10 years. He rolled 2 cigarettes and bit the ends of each to release the flavor. He offered one to the man in black, who took it. Each of them took a burning twig from the fire. The gunslinger lit his cigarette and drew the aromatic smoke deep into his lungs, closing his eyes to concentrate the senses. He blew out with long, slow satisfaction. Is it good? The man in black inquired. Yes, very good. Enjoy it. Maybe the last smoke for you in a very long time. The gunslinger took this impassively. Very well, the man in black said. To begin, then. You must understand the tower has always been, and there have always been boys who know of it and who lust for it. More than power or riches or women, boys who look for the doors that lead to it. There was a talk then, a night's worth of talk, and God alone knew how much more, or how much was true, but the gunslinger remembered little of it later, and to his oddly practical mind little of it seemed to matter. The man in black told him again that he must go to the sea, which lay no more than 20 easy miles to the west, and there he would be invested with the power of drawing. That's not exactly right either, the man in black said, pitching his cigarette into the remains of the campfire. No one wants to invest you with a power of any kind, gunslinger. It's simply in you, and I'm compelled to tell you, partly because of the sacrifice of the boy, and partly because it's the law, the natural law of things. Water must run downhill, and you must be told. You will draw 3, I understand, but I don't really care, and I don't really want to know. The 3, the gunslinger murmured, thinking of the oracle. And then the fun begins, but by then I'll be long gone. Goodbye, gunslinger. My part is done now. The chain is still in your hands, where it doesn't wrap itself round your neck. Compelled by something outside him, Roland said, You have one more thing to say, don't you? Yes, the man in black said, and smiled at the gunslinger with his depthless eyes and stretched one of his hands out toward him. Let there be light. And there was light, and this time the light was good. Roland awoke by the ruins of the campfire to find himself 10 years older. His back hair had thinned
His black hair had thinned at his temples and had gone the gray of cobwebs at the end of autumn. The lines in his face were deeper, his skin rougher. The remains of the wood he carried had turned to something like stone, and the man in black was a laughing skeleton in a rotting black robe. More bones in this place of bones, one more skull in this Golgotha. Or is it really you? He thought. I have my doubts, Walter O'Dim. I have my doubts, Martin. That was. 1 second. All right, sorry about that. Where was I? He stood up and looked around. Then, with a sudden quick gesture, he reached toward the remains of his companion of the night before. If it was indeed the remains of Walter. A night that had somehow lasted 10 years. He broke off the grinning jawbone and jammed it carelessly into the left hip pocket of his jeans, a fitting enough replacement for the one lost under the mountains. How many lies did you tell me? He asked. Many, he was sure. But what made them good lies was that they had been mixed with the truth. The tower, somewhere ahead, it waited for him. The nexus of time, the nexus of size. He began west again, his back set against the sunrise, heading toward the ocean, realizing that a great passage of his life had come and gone. I loved you, Jake, he said aloud. The stiffness wore out of his body, and he began to walk more rapidly. By that evening, he had come to the end of the land. He sat on a beach which stretched left and right forever, deserted. The waves beat endlessly against the shore, pounding and pounding. The setting sun painted the water in a wide strip of fool's gold. There the gunslinger sat, his face turned up into the fading light. He dreamed his dreams and watched as the stars came out. His purpose did not flag, nor did his heart falter. His hair, finer now and gray at the temples, blew around his head, and the sandalwood inlaid guns of his father lay smooth and deadly against his hips, and he lay lonely, but did not find loneliness in any way a bad or ignoble thing. The dark came down, and the world moved on. The gunslinger waited for the time of the drawing, and dreamed his long dreams of the dark tower, to which he would some day come at dusk, and approach, winding his horn to do some unimaginable final battle. Winding his horn to do some unimaginable final battle. And that is the end of book one. That is the end of book one. We are done with the gunslinger. The next book, surprise, surprise, will aptly be named The Drawing of the Three. At least it's not The Wheel of Time. That is a much longer series. But this one is one of my favorites. So we'll get through it. And we'll start book two possibly next week. I'm 90% sure we'll start it next week, but it could be the week after. Lots and lots has been going on, which is why I haven't been streaming, except for the book club stuff in the last few weeks. But yeah, we will definitely figure that out at some point. Also, let me know if the earlier time or the later time works for you guys, because I went from like I think I started at like 5:30 or 6 o'clock, and then I started this one at like 10:30, right? So, I don't know which time works better for you, and I will try to more often do the time that works best for everybody. But that's also not a guarantee because life is hectic. Right now, I'm waiting on Super Munchkin to to get here. She's driving into town tonight. I'm really excited to see her. But anyway, thank you everyone for coming. As always, thank you for your patience, for when I stumble, for when the dogs are barking and squeaking toys, and there's background noise in the house, and all of those things. You are lovely, and I'll see you next time.